This is the second video in the shared description series, and what we're looking at is my dice. I have a lot of dice for reasons relating to where we play and the number of people with whom we play. Oh, you certainly don't need this many. I use these stones for the Destiny pool, and they're generated using the Force die. That's not something you have to worry about narrating. Although at the beginning of each session, everyone should be aware of the number of light and dark tokens available in the Destiny pool. It can be used as a way to prime the atmosphere, if you like. And the percentile dice, they also aren't really a factor in needing to be narrated in terms of their results. They will tell you which obligation or which duty or how morality is being affected in a particular session, and that will inform how play is conducted. But the rolls themselves, either whether for crits or for triggering obligations and the like, it's not something you need to worry about narrating. Spending these, you might want to consider what they represent, that being the flow of the Force and its interactions with the character's destiny. You might want to consider making that flavor your descriptions. But usually what you're going to worry about creating narrative effects for are these skill dice and the proficiency dice, the difficulty dice, the challenge dice, maybe some setback, maybe some boost. It's possible that someone might be using a Force die in your group, but generally that's just generating resources for that Force-sensitive character to spend. So again, it may or may not influence how you describe things. But let's set up a typical situation. Let's say a starting character, let's say with a 3 agility and a 2 skill in ranged light. We're firing at some onrushing stormtroopers. Now, if they announce as their action that they are taking a shot, then they're going to have to build the positive side of the pool. The controlling characteristic in this case will be agility, which is a 3, meaning they get a pool of 3 dice, but they have a skill of 2, so 2 of those dice get upgraded. So this is the positive side of the pool before any modifiers get in. And let's further say that this is a medium range shot, and that they're using a standard blaster, and that it's able to reach to medium range. So the difficulty there will be 2. So the Game Master contributes 2. That's the base pool. And it's possible that circumstances might add in setback or might add in boost, or I might spend a dark side point from the Destiny pool to upgrade the difficulty, but for the sake of example number 1, let's not do that. Let's just roll and see what happens. Okay, so everything has scattered. So let's bring it back. This is what was rolled. Make sure it's in focus. So we have 2 threats and 2 advantages. They cancel. We have 1 success and 1 failure. They cancel. And we are left with 2 advantages. Now, that's fantastic for the first example, because people might be saying, well, how do I narrate this? The answer is to go through in order. First, we need to determine if the action that was declared, firing at the stormtroopers, was successful or not. Now, in the rules it describes that if there are no uncancelled successes, the action fails. Now, we can get into interpretation of that, but for right now, we won't. Let's just say that this attack has failed, meaning the character does not have the opportunity to inflict damage on their target. So, this could be narrated in a number of ways. It could be an outright miss. Then you're left with, what do my 2 advantages mean? But the stormtroopers are armored, right? So, what if this failed but somehow advantageous attack, instead of dealing wounds to the target, which was its goal, instead strikes the target, does no damage, therefore cannot apply wounds, but causes setback on the stormtrooper's next action. I buy the setback for the stormtrooper with my advantages. It gets applied to their next roll, gets applied to their attack because they're stormtroopers, that's what they're going to do. I didn't miss. I didn't do damage, I didn't get through the armor. However, my shot gave me some advantage. This is the basic way to approach the system in a procedural sense. Did I pass or fail? How do I interpret the remaining results? And then what can I do with them? Now, some groups might be comfortable just stopping there, and that's fine. But it doesn't have to stop there. It can be described. And that's what this video is really about. So, let's do that. Let's have some fun. So the dice have finished clattering across the table. I have matched and canceled. I've recognized that I've got 2 advantages and I failed. I did not succeed. And I know that with 2 advantages, I can buy a setback die for my opponent or the next adversary that goes. All of this is happening in my head. And the more familiar I am with the game, the faster that recognition process is taking place. It's also happening for everybody around the table. They're evaluating what can the player do with those 2 advantages. Will they reduce their strain threshold, or will they do something else? Will they get boost dice to pass on to the next player character? But it's my decision. So after the recognition phase is over, I open my mouth and I say, I level my blaster, my hand's shaking a little bit as we run down the hall and firing over my shoulder, and I target the lead stormtrooper. I pull the trigger, but it slams into his shoulder plate, and there's a flare of energy, but he's unhurt. Okay, the game master is curious. What am I going to do with my 2 advantages? So then I say, that flare of light will maybe cause the stormtrooper to flinch and hesitate. And I look at the game master. The game master understands and applies setback to the pool. What if, instead of having rolled 2 advantages, what we were left with were 2 threats? What would change? Well, first off, the person controlling the narration changes. In a case with positive dice, that falls on the player, the person who did the rolling, to decide how things are spent. But in the case of negative dice, that's where the opposition steps in. So when stormtroopers are firing on you, the player, receiving the incoming fire, you get to decide how to deal with the threats or possibly despair symbols that might come up. But when it's you firing on NPCs, then it's the game master who gets to decide what happens with these. Now, the scale of narration will basically be the same. There's an awful lot of parallel between what one advantage can do and what one threat can do. So in this case, we have 2 threats and only 2 threats. The action is defined as a failure. Everything else has canceled out. Right? We don't have any failure symbols showing. We have no success symbol showing. We have no advantages left. The only things left are 2 threats. What will we do?
With 2 threats showing, there are a couple of things that the game master can do, and probably the easiest of these is simply to assign strain. And then the player needs to deal with the question of, from where does this strain come? And people around the table can contribute, and the game master can contribute ideas to where the strain comes from. But it could be something purely physical, but it could also be emotional, or it could be tied to something specific, like an obligation or a motivation. In our own campaign, one of the characters has the motivation of keeping the family together, and failing a shot in this manner, particularly because gun combat is so much a part of what he offers that we could definitely follow that psychological trail where that stress and strain is coming from, if he's letting us down, if he's putting us at risk by not performing at his best. But we've got 2 threats showing, and an easy way to spend 2 threats is where we could apply setback to our next action. I could apply it to the active character's next action or an ally's. But even cooler in this line is offering the opponent the opportunity to take a maneuver, a free, out-of-turn maneuver right now. Not later during their turn, but right now. Instead of giving a boost die to the stormtroopers, or instead of giving the next player character a setback, the Game Master could have the stormtrooper take an out-of-turn maneuver to allow them to take cover. So, rather than having to take a defensive action on their own turn, limiting what they can do during their turn, they get to do it now.
If the stormtrooper doesn't have to use their maneuver on their own turn to take cover against my return fire, they could do something even more dangerous to me, like taking aim. So this ramps up the thrill of the scene and also helps contribute to the description. The stormtroopers then take on the activities that we see in the films, them ducking for cover, them getting behind door frames, and we are taking over some of the narrative burden from the Game Master without intruding on the parts of the flow of the scene for which that person in that chair is ideally suited. Let's use a more complicated die pool for the next example. Let's say the difficulty has been upgraded and that there are environmental situations which provide a negative, but we're getting some assistance, and this is our basic ability with the skill. Let's say that this is an attempt to slice against security. Okay, so this is our slicing pool. This is our, in this case, a computer's check, or in certain cases, a skullduggery check, versus this difficulty. This was the skill of the opponent who set up the security in the first place. Right. Now, we're not using the best tools for the job, but we have someone on lookout providing us guidance through the setup of the system. Okay, so that represents what this pool means. So this is an allied slicer who's feeding us intelligence. This is the difficulty based on the skill of the original programmer. This is the poorness of my tools, and this is me. So then I would gather up these dice to roll. All right. So, what's interesting, not required, but an interesting part of using this dice pool in this way is that the source of the dice don't have to matter to your description, but can. So, we end up with, look at all the threat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 threats. Two failures, 5 threats. And for successes, well, we ended up with blanks. We have 2 advantages, which cancel 2 threats. We have another advantage, which cancels a threat, which downgrades that just to a success. All right. That 1 success takes out 1 failure. The blanks are gone, and we're left with 1 failure and 2 threats. We are not successful in our bid to cut through the security. We failed. Why did we fail? Was it because of our gear? No, that die has been canceled, right? It was because, we could say, the original quality of the software programming was so high, it just simply outclassed me. In the description, the failure simply means I do not succeed. I was trying to penetrate the security. I did not. The threats. Now here we could get kind of interesting. I could take this as strain, but why? What was it about trying to slice my way into this computer terminal would give me stress? Well, again, let's turn it around and look at the source of my failure. I'm saying that the source of my failure was the quality of the programming. So maybe this is a programmer about whom I have heard. And as I'm trying to slice my way through the barriers of computer security that person has crafted, I psyched myself out. For this last example, let's use a manufactured result to make sure that we get something, the kind of result that people worry about. So, taking a look at this, let's say that these are the uncanceled results from a real roll. Now let's further say that the success associated with the triumph and the failure associated with the despair, they cancel each other out, leaving us with just these two successes, two threats, the triumph by itself and the despair by itself. This sort of thing can seem very complicated, for sure. And as they don't happen very often, it can take a little bit longer to get used to this kind of result, to build up the habit of dealing with this result. But it follows the same pattern as everything else. The very first thing we need to do is to decide, based on successes, if our action was successful or not. Once that is determined, right, we know that we were successful, then we look at threats and advantages. And we're left with two threats. Then we deal with the triumph, and then we deal with the despair. Let's further address the type of roll that people often have difficulty with, the astrogation roll. So let's say because of our two successes, we have successfully done our astrogation calculations. We're not going to appear in the heart of a sun or something. We're going to arrive somewhere and not die in so doing. It was a very difficult check, perhaps made under duress, which explains the setback die being present and explains the challenge die being present. Now the challenge has given us a despair. So that's something that's going to be in the back of our mind, but the stated goal was to go from one system to another system via hyperspace. We have done so successfully. So to put this in perspective, let's put the dice in order. We have successfully arrived. This is done. Now we need to deal with the threat. Something has caused us strain, or something is giving us a problem. We're going to have a setback on our next action, for example. And let's take a look at that. So we've come out of hyperspace. We're thinking successfully. However, we're experiencing these threats. An easy way to handle two threats is to assign a setback die to a future action. So let's do that. Let's say that we have come out in a part of the solar system that was unexpected and unintended, and that then feeds us into these, which is kind of interesting. Now, what can we do with a triumph, and what can we do with a despair? We do not have to consider them together, but we will have to deal with their effects. In combat, these effects are often narrated as something that could be summarized as do something vital. One phrase that constantly circles around my table is turn the tide of battle. So, starting with the triumph, we've come out of hyperspace. We've come out in a position that we weren't expecting. This is going to add a setback to, our specific plan, because we're coming out at the wrong angle, too far or too close to what we had been shooting for. But the triumph, do something vital. The triumph is going to expose something, provide a benefit to us, a more long-lived benefit to us than we were expecting. And finally, the despair. Well, the despair is exactly the same thing. So let's go back through this roll. We successfully reached the system that we were intending. We come out of hyperspace, everything is functioning smoothly. However, it takes a moment for the pilot to recognize exactly where we are. We've entered the system from a completely unexpected angle, suggesting we were deflected in flight, and we are nearing a small cluster of asteroids. Navigating through the asteroids, on the outer edges, we recognize that there is a massive amount of salvage present, salvage that we desperately need and can easily collect, allowing us to bolster our paycheck on this run. However, we're not the only ones here. And that, hopefully, in some kind of nutshell, is the way that I try to approach using the narrative dice to bolster description, to help people feel comfortable in what they can suggest and what they can tailor around the table, and maybe providing some kind of suggestion about what a source of a particular detail might be. Now, I guess there's really one last thing left. As I mentioned at the start of the clip, these dice are often left out of narration, as they typically simply generate a resource. Do I or don't I have enough force points to perform the force power that I would like to do this turn? But if you'll notice, there are dark side and light side points, and it is from this that narration can come. If I am shooting for these, if I need 3 light force points, but instead of getting them, I get this roll instead, then what this represents is not that I do not have the strength to use the force in the way that I want, but that in so doing, I am being tempted. I'm drawing upon my emotions. I'm drifting toward the dark side in order to make it happen. I could separate myself from that. I could do a lesser effect because my attention is divided in pushing my dark side down, or I could surrender to it. I could surrender to my anger, for example, or I could let go of my hatred and direct it at my target and so accomplish my effect, and I can feel the rush of power from the dark side. I can feel this surge of emotional energy coupled with the flow of the force, and I can delude myself into thinking it is more powerful. And I have just, simply by rolling these dice for a resource in the game, I have just woven my character's perspective, my character's internal life into the narrative, into the description, and that, I think, is fantastic. And that really is represented among all of these dice all the way through the game.